Hey everyone, welcome back to Next Up Live. I'm Ben Hawbrooks, your host, and every week what we get to do is we look at cybersecurity, fintech, and get a little bit behind the scenes look at NXTsoft, at this company and what we're working on. So actually I have something really special for you guys today. Obviously, Election Day is tomorrow. So on the eve of Election Day, I have with me today Will Taylor, Senior Cybersecurity Consultant at NXTsoft. And Will, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I have Will on today because he has some firsthand experience working on election cybersecurity, which is super interesting. But I want to hear from you, Will. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
So I was working in 2017. I was working with the state of Alabama. I was the deputy director of infrastructure for the Office of Information Technology, and they had had some problems during the previous election cycle with availability of some data, specifically the results for some of the election data. There was a large election event, and there were some problems with reporting on the election results for different municipalities and districts. So about 6 months before the 2017 election, between Doug Jones and Roy Moore, it was decided that we needed to do a lot of work, that there's a lot of work that needed to be done specifically geared around the availability of some of that data. So I was tasked with leading a task force that was going to review a lot of the different parts and pieces of the election infrastructure, specifically on the server side where all the election results were coming in. And they knew that that was going to be a really big turnout, a really big election. So we were tasked with reviewing, assessing, and helping kind of beef up a lot of the infrastructure and the services that surrounded the availability of that data. And we had about 4.5 months to institute a lot of changes, put a lot of things in place so that the election results would be there. So, in the CIA is what we call it, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of that data. My focus was on really the availability as much as anything else. There was another state agency that was more responsible for the confidentiality and the integrity, but by hook or by crook, we ended up getting pulled into that as well. So uh, that was about a 4.5 month process, and then one of the things that we really kind of harped on was after the election, reviewing and auditing a lot of that. So that was my experience with that. I ended up working there for several years and being involved with the election security for several other elections that had much bigger turnouts, coincidentally. But that was really my experience on that end, and I got to see a lot of how all of it works together. And that was kind of the part that I didn't understand. I understood the server side, I understood the web servers and the database servers that were involved, but the scope and the scale of how all these different districts are responsible for collecting election data, transporting and distributing election data was kind of an eye opener for me.
Wow, I bet that's incredible. That flesh that out a little bit for me. Paint a picture of the election security landscape. Like, what are all the factors that are at play going on there?
Some of the factors that are really hard to kind of plan for and attack are that there are so many different voting districts and locations. Here locally, where I live in Central Alabama, I go and vote at a church. You may vote at a fire station if you live. I'm from rural Alabama. I grew up on a 400-acre farm in an unincorporated area, and you went and voted at the local volunteer fire department. So one of the biggest hurdles to overcome on that landscape really is where people go and vote, where that data is collected. The physical security of that is something that has to be taken into account. The technical security has to be taken into account. The area where I'm from until probably 2005 didn't have high-speed internet. So there's some locations where the election data is tabulated on a machine and it's kept on tapes, and those tapes have to be driven to The county seat in the case where I'm from is Clanton, Alabama, and then that data has to be uploaded. So the landscape really is disparate and separated, and every voting location is different. But once that data is collected in a central location, then really the security comes to the data at rest. So the data in transit, the data being transmitted from all of these voting districts or county seats, that data has to be protected while it's in transit. And then once it makes it to the central location where it's going to be tabulated and audited and file integrity checks, data integrity checks, there's a lot that has to go right. I think that's the thing that was kind of an eye-opener for me, was how many things have to go right in order to not only successfully collect that data and then host it somewhere on a server. And in the case of the state of Alabama, it was not a Windows-based server, it was a mainframe system. And then how much has to go right to successfully present it in a timely manner and accurately present the final vote counts for all these different districts and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot that has to go right. The challenge really is, there's a lot of different challenges. Again, from the physical security at the voting locations to the software has to work correctly. Somebody has to be responsible for ensuring the integrity of the software. Somebody has to be responsible for ensuring the integrity of the final kind of tabulated vote counts. So there's a lot of parts and pieces. There's a lot of different local governments and municipality people in charge of the municipalities that have their part to play, and getting everyone kind of singing from the same hymnal is a really big challenge.
What would you say are the most prevalent election cybersecurity risks, given your experience?
I learned a lot about the election process, and I think some of the biggest eye openers for me in my time in leading some of this was, and especially here in the last couple of years. The first one I worked on was in 2017, and the front end of an election. The biggest one of the biggest threats right now is kind of disinformation. Nobody owns the truth anymore. And I didn't understand this until I got involved in the process, but the individual campaigns traditionally are responsible for monitoring and reporting disinformation, which is kind of like having, there's no independence there, right? So the campaigns themselves are as responsible as any other party for reporting disinformation. And in this day and age, when everyone and their grandmother has a Facebook account, and there's so much disinformation out there, whether it's intentional or not, that may be disinformation about polling places and times that you can go and vote. That may be disinformation about who can vote and where you can vote, and who's allowed to, and what kind of forms of identification you have to have. So there's a lot of misinformation that's out there. And there's kind of an onus on the campaigns to report it, but there's also a burden and an onus on the individual people who are going to vote to be able to decide what they're reading and if it's true or not. And it's the easiest thing in the world to share disinformation, even if it's not malicious or intentional. But it's the easiest thing in the world to share something if it evokes an emotion in you, and you read something about a campaign or about a politician that's happening, and just to share it immediately. It really is like kudzu. I mean, it's one of the biggest problems right now with our political landscape and the election process. Even if it doesn't originate from a foreign, government acting in unison with each other, it depends on how it's perpetuated by our citizens. That's what gives it power. So I think disinformation on the front end of an election is one of the biggest issues that we're seeing. But after the votes have been cast, after the ballots have been cast, there's a lot of different issues right now. One of them is that a lot of the states are using outdated and unpatched software and firmware and hardware. So recently, a couple of years ago, Congress gave the state of Alabama and 5 other states like $380 million to work on election security issues. And every county in the state of Alabama at that time, except for Montgomery, so 63 other counties, were using voting systems that were over 10 years old. Even if it wasn't the machine that you stood at that was over 10 years old, the hardware and the software in the background was 10 years old, and the company that manufactured those systems had gone out of business. So one of the issues that we helped with, we weren't wholly responsible for mitigating this risk, but one of the things we helped with was, how do you replace parts? How do you patch software that's 10 years old, and the original vendor of that software and that hardware is no longer in business? And we really had to kind of wrap our heads around every one of those endpoints was a potential weakness that we had to factor in. And then one of the others is that all of these are using third-party software and vendors. So in 2016, there was election tampering in Florida due to a gap that one of the vendors had. So the states really do have to partner with these vendors, and there's a really big need for the states to set and insist on really strong SLAs, really strong security postures, security agreements with these vendors, and then going back behind them and auditing that and making sure that those SLAs, those patches, that all of those security gaps that the state is responsible for internally, that these vendors they're working with, that they're on that same level of compliance. One of the things that we noticed with some of not the election counting computers or any of that, but some of the ancillary servers and workstations that were involved in the 2017 election, one of the things that we caught early on was that some of them lacked any kind of endpoint protection or any kind of central logging for endpoint protection. So one of the things that we did was kind of unify the endpoint protection, the antivirus, the anti-malware. We got that all on a unified platform wherever we could. Again, we were more responsible for the data at rest after it was hosted, after it had been sent from all these municipalities and voting districts. But wherever we could, we wanted to come in and lock down endpoint protection, and not just have endpoint protection installed, but have all that logging and aggregating logs for all of that. And then one of the other really big security issues right now, threats in this whole landscape, is that a lot of the voter registration platforms, they have some of the same problems. They have some of the same vulnerabilities. And a lot of that issue is wrapped around identity and authentication management. How do you know that the person who's registering to vote under a certain name is actually who they say they are? So that's been a big piece of the puzzle, is how do you set things up? How do you set yourself up for success at the voter registration step, all the way through the voting process, and tabulating and collecting that data locally, transmitting that data to the central location where it's going to be stored, and then ensuring that that data is going to be that it's going to have integrity, and that it's going to be available. That the people who the citizens of the state of Alabama or the United States are going to have access to that data once the votes are counted, and that they're going to be able to see that their vote counted. So that, coupled with the training of local officials, again, all of these voting locations depend on volunteers and local government to man those polling stations. And there was a lot of the funds that have been poured into election security have gone towards end user education and awareness training, understanding that how to protect the data that they are collecting, and that they're responsible for that, and that really has to count. That their vote, people need to know that their vote counts. So a lot of that funding has gone towards training, and that's really a huge necessary step. both at the polling stations and on the other end of things, in the servers and the web servers, and where all of that data ends up, so that it can be available for the citizens to see their votes count.
Yeah.
And then one of the other things that we really kind of locked in on after the excitement and the huge rush of working the election was, we would always have a post-election audit where we went through all of the policies and the procedures and the technologies and the programs and the plans and the software that we put in place. We audited all of that. So we didn't just come up with good opinions and good ideas and then just hope for the best and right off into the sunset when the election was over. One of the most important facets of what we did was, after the operation was complete, after all the votes were counted, after they were all transmitted or transported, after everything else was done, we went through and did a post-election audit. It was a very rigorous process, conducted on all of the election-related equipment that we controlled. So we went through all the processes, all the threats, the risks, the results, and the performance of all of our systems, to make sure that the way we were doing things, even if it was successful, that it was the best way to do them.
Hmm. Well, now I understand what you mean when you say there are a lot of things that have to go right.
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
that just sounds like such an undertaking. But I'm encouraged to hear that good people like you and others that were part of the teams that you worked with either have worked or are working on this and pouring resources and time and effort into making sure every step of the process is being handled very thoroughly and appropriately. So here's a final question for you. Is what average voter, average person, what can we do to mitigate the risks that you just outlined? I mean, there's some of them obviously are technical, other ones are a little bit more accessible to regular people. But for the average voter, what can we do?
Uh, and some of this is anecdotal. This would be my experience, having been voting for 22 years, but some of it will be based on what I saw in my time working on the election. I think the biggest thing that the average voter can do is more before the election than it is maybe after. So in this case, my opinion, and it's just that, um, the core mission for any disinformation campaign is to have people lose confidence in the whole process. And sure enough, there are some issues in our process. There are some issues with all the things I mentioned, whether that's the disinformation campaigns have been very successful. And part of the reason that they're so successful is people consider the content before they consider the source. So really, to me, the biggest thing that the average voter can do to make sure that their vote counts is understand and be able to recognize when they're being targeted by disinformation. Whether that's about, like I said, whether that's about political or policy issues in politics, or whether that's about when they can go and vote, or who's allowed to vote and who has the right to vote. Really being able to lock in and ensure that the places you're getting information are from viable sources. Again, the content is never going to be more important than the source. So on the front end of things, understanding that when you live in one of the freest countries in the world, and that's the champion of democracy for as long as our country has been, there are going to be people who try to do their best to undermine the whole process. And just like anything else, being able to identify when someone is or is not being truthful with you. And again, that may be your friend on Facebook or your great aunt or whomever. Always consider the source when it comes to this time of year. The airwaves are inundated with political messages, and every party is throwing the kitchen sink at the voters. But really, to me, the average voter, the thing they can do is understand the issues and be able to identify when they're being editorialized or when someone's throwing disinformation at them.
All right, great, excellent. Yeah, that's great advice, and I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing so much from your own experience, Will.
Oh,
Um,
thank you. I appreciate the time.
and yeah, thanks for your time. And we'll call that a wrap today. I appreciate it, Will. And obviously here at NXTsoft and Threat Advice, we really value good cyber education and awareness. So I'm glad to hear that's a big part of election cybersecurity as well. But Will, thanks again for coming on today.
Thank you, Ben. Y'all have a good day.
All righty, thanks everyone for watching.